Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to set up a Windows 10 virtual machine, and this is hopefully a quick tutorial which will talk you through the process of what a virtual machine is used for, what the pros and cons of it are, and just the process of setting up your computer to run a virtual machine and then creating the virtual machine itself. There are a lot of things which are going to be outside of the scope of this video, such as setting up backups, running virtual machines in different virtual environments, things like Proxmox, VMware. They're not covered here. We're going to use VirtualBox, nice and simple, free software that you can download, and it should be fairly straightforward to follow. You should end up with something that looks a little like this. As you can see, this is Windows 10. Whereas my own computer, my host computer, is running Windows 11. So this can be used for trying out a new operating system, trying out different pieces of software, doing some sketchy stuff, things you might not want to do on your own computer for fear of viruses or any other potential backlash you might have from doing those particular things. If you have any questions about this video, about the process I went through, anything tech related even, pop it in the comments down below, and I'm hoping to make more tutorials and videos like this, so if you want to see that sort of stuff, subscribe. So here we go. So one of the first steps in setting up a virtual machine is to enable virtualization on your host computer. This process varies depending on whether your host computer uses an Intel processor or an AMD processor. I have steps included for both, but depending on the model of computer, or more specifically the model of motherboard, you may have to Google or look around to see if this setting is on already, or if not, how to turn it on. The steps vary slightly depending on different motherboards, so take that as you will. One thing that you can do to check if it's already enabled on your system is to open a command prompt window, which I've intentionally shrunk down to an unusual size here, and you can then run the command, which is systeminfo, all one word. I'm intentionally masking some details about my own system here, but you can see right at the very end, Hyper-V requirements and virtualization enabled in firmware is set to yes. That means that virtualization has been enabled in the BIOS on this machine and virtual machines can run. So before we get to the point of actually downloading VirtualBox in order to set up our virtual machine, we need to enter our computer's BIOS, or basic input-output system, to confirm that virtualization is enabled. To enter the BIOS on your computer, generally you can restart the computer, and as it starts up, tap the delete key. This will usually give you an option to either go straight to the BIOS, or it could be an F key like F2 or F10 or F12 that you would tap during startup, and you'll either get a boot menu or it'll bring you straight to the BIOS. The BIOS is a very basic looking system in most cases, slightly more advanced on fancier motherboards, which you'll see in the AMD clip coming up. And once you're in the BIOS, follow the instructions in the next clip, whichever is relevant for your machine, and you should be able to then enable virtualization. So here we are in the BIOS of an Intel based system. You can see at the top of the screen it says it's an Intel Core i7-8550U processor. Any Intel based system should have the same option within the BIOS. We're going to use the arrow keys on the keyboard to navigate to the advanced menu, and from within there you'll find the option for Intel VTX. We want to make sure that that's enabled, and then press F10 and choose Save Changes and Exit. That will then bring you through to the normal Windows startup. So here we are in the BIOS of an AMD based system. This is a Gigabyte Aorus motherboard, and we're in the easy mode by default. So we hit F2 to switch to advanced mode, and within the tweaker menu you should find the option for advanced CPU settings, and from there you can then enable SVM mode. And in the tooltip in the bottom left you can see that's relating to CPU virtualization, and just enable it, hit F10, save your changes and exit. And apologies for the quality of the footage here, this was handheld camera, unfortunately that was the only option available. So here we are on the VirtualBox download page. It's virtualbox.org/wiki/downloads. Quick Google will do it for you. And we are running a Windows host, and that is that our computer runs Windows, and the computer that you are using is going to be the host, and the virtual machine that you will run is going to be the guest. Just some terminology to learn there. So we are looking to install VirtualBox onto a Windows host. So we're going to click Windows Hosts, and that will automatically download the installer for you, which I've already done. And once you open that installer, you will be presented with the install wizard. Just going to proceed through this as normal. Do bear in mind that during this install process, your network connection may get disconnected briefly. It's part of the process due to it installing some virtual networking devices. Don't need to worry too much about the details. Just know that your internet's going to cut off on this particular computer for a second. You can usually just leave all the options as default. Here's the warning about your network about to be disconnected, and click yes, install, and let that proceed. Now I currently have VirtualBox running, and this is what this warning is telling me about, so I need to make sure to close that. Right there. I'm very silly. There we go. And retry. When I'm still running, it'll disappear in a second. There we go. And that's just, you can't install a program, a new version of a program that's already running on your machine. Should be fairly simple and straightforward. Once the install here is complete, we'll be presented with the basic VirtualBox window. I already have some virtual machines set up, but I will be going through the process of setting up a new one for the purposes of this video. Okay, and the install should be just about done. There we go, and now you have the option to start VirtualBox immediately, and we will do that. So once VirtualBox opens up here, this is the interface. Now I have just updated to a new version, and there is a VirtualBox extension pack update available. This is optional. This just gives you more integration with the virtual machines that you run. Again, not something you need to worry about for this particular guide, but it is something that I like to do as I use virtual machines for a number of things, and it can be helpful in those situations. It's another next finish job. Just keep clicking next or OK and finish the install once it's done. So this is VirtualBox. Now there's a lot of terminology, a lot of technical terms being used here. I'm not going to explain everything, that would take forever, but I am going to just explain some of the basics and some of the stuff that you will need to know in order to run a virtual machine. So because our goal today is to run a Windows virtual machine, as in to create a testbed or a sandbox for your own uses, again for trialing software, for doing things that you don't want to do on your main computer and jeopardize that computer, virtual machines are perfect for that. So that's what we're going to do today. So if you want to set up a new virtual machine, click the new button. What do you want to call it? I generally go with something very simple. We're going to create a Windows 10 testbed today. So we'll say Windows 10 testbed. The machine folder. Now this is where it's going to, VirtualBox is going to save some files relating to this virtual machine. So it's just some small files, the configuration, what hardware you've given the VM, etc. You don't really need to change this, but just know that that is where those files are going to. And in my case, it's in my user folder, slimb, and in VirtualBox VMs. The version or type, it'll automatically detect that, and based on the name sometimes, and you can choose whichever of these is appropriate. We're sticking with Microsoft Windows today. Version of Windows, Windows 10, 64-bit. If you're unsure, it's most likely going to be 64-bit in this day and age in 2022, and we are going to be using Windows 10 for this example. You can also set up Windows 11, as you can see here in the background, or any other version of Windows that you might want to mess around with. So just going to click next. So it's telling us that we have a problem here, that this folder already exists. So we're going to just have to put it into a new folder. We'll just click other, and we will create Okay, I had a Windows 10 testbed previously that I'm not remembering. Let's call this one YouTube testbed. How does that sound? Excellent. So we're going to select that folder and click select folder. And just for consistency, we'll also change the name of our VM to YouTube testbed. So just going to interject here just to correct a mistake I made in the original video. The memory size here, you can see the recommended memory size is 2048. When I originally set up the VM, this was 1024, I believe, which is the minimum required RAM for a Linux-based virtual machine. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that when I changed the name of the virtual machine to YouTube testbed, VirtualBox then didn't automatically detect that it was Windows and Windows 10. So I have now gone back and corrected that and changed the memory to 4 gigabytes or 4096 megabytes. And you can also see that the recommended size for a hard disk, the virtual hard disk, is now 50 gigabytes. Windows is a bit bigger in terms of operating systems than Linux, which is why these numbers are different than what you're about to see. But we're going to go ahead and create a 50 gigabyte virtual hard disk and use that. So we click next. Now it's asking us about memory. In this case, memory is RAM, as it says, and we want to allocate as much RAM as we possibly can, or that we think we might need. I would always recommend 2 gigabytes, which in megabytes is 2048. Computers count in 2s, or in 8s I should say, due to binary. Don't worry about it, just 2048 in there. If you're not sure how much RAM your computer has, and you want to find that out, very quick and easy way is to open the task manager, which you can do by right clicking a blank area of your taskbar and click task manager. And then in the task manager screen, provided you're running Windows 10 or Windows 11, go to performance, and in memory it'll show you the available memory that you have here, or up here even. In my case, I have 32 gigabytes of RAM, or 31.9 as it shows here, so I have enough RAM to dedicate at least 2 to this virtual machine. And just in case it's not clear, this is RAM that's going to be taken from the host computer, again that's your computer, and given to the virtual computer. So your host computer will not be able to use that RAM while the virtual machine is running. Not all the time, but only when the virtual machine is running, that RAM will be dedicated to that VM. So I'm going to click next. It's asking us, do we want to create a virtual hard disk? So again, all of the hardware for a virtual machine is virtual. It's not real life hardware, things that you can pick up. It's pieces of the host computer, your computer, which are then virtualized and shown to the virtual machine. So in this case, we need to take a small chunk of our hard drive, or any hard drive, whether it be an external USB drive, or if you have multiple hard drives in your computer, any one of them will do. But we're taking a small chunk of one of those hard drives to give to the VM. There are some fancy things you can do with this, like having dynamically sized storage. So that means having a hard drive, a virtual hard drive, that is only going to be as big as the files within it. And that's useful if you need to save hard drive space or anything like it. I'm just going to create a 20 gigabyte static sized virtual machine for this, and we're going to select the option to create a virtual hard disk now to do that. So we click create. This option here is just various types of virtual hard disks. If you're only setting this up as a testbed, as we are in this guide, stick with the default VirtualBox disk image. The rest are irrelevant for this. And again, this is what I mentioned previously, dynamically allocated or a fixed size drive. We'll just select fixed size. You can choose to experiment with these here. It's not really going to cause many problems in what we're trying to do. And you can see here, we just take out a 1, put in a 2 to make a 20 gigabyte drive. You can also scale using this graph here. So we click create, and this is now creating 20 gigabytes of storage space on our hard drive, which is going to be made into a virtual machine, or a virtual hard disk, I should say. And there we go. And now you can see that we have our YouTube testbed virtual machine here in our list of VMs, or virtual machines. Now, there are some things we need to change. Okay, for a start, we haven't installed Windows yet. We haven't actually installed any operating system yet, and we can make some changes and install various other things if you'd like. But for now, we're just going to click into settings, and we're going to go through these very quickly and just choose what we need, nothing extra. So the type, this should say Microsoft Windows. Not sure how it changed over to Linux, but let's not worry about that. And Windows 10 64-bit right there. Okay, now in VirtualBox you may see this sometimes, invalid settings detected. This is just a little warning to say that some of the settings you have in here are not correct for the type of operating system that you've selected here. So it's good to mouse over this and read the tooltip. And this is to do with video memory, which we'll be coming to in just a moment anyway. So we're going to just ignore that and we'll come back to it if needed. So we click into Advanced, and you can change some of these settings here if you like. The snapshot folder is where you're going to create snapshots or backups of the VM. We're not really worried about that in this case for now. The shared clipboard is if you want to be able to copy and paste text or files between your host computer, as in your own computer, and this virtual computer. And drag and drop is just another fancier version of that, where you can just drag files straight into the virtual machine. A lot of this is not going to be overly intuitive, but it will become easier to understand once we actually get a virtual machine running and you see that it's a computer that runs inside a window on your own computer. The description tab here just has nothing. You can type a description yourself if you like. And disk encryption here, if you want to encrypt the virtual hard disk that we created for safety's sake, you can do that here. This is mainly if your computer is shared with multiple people and you don't want them to be able to see the contents of your virtual hard disks. You can decide to encrypt it here. The description field is also for when your computer is shared with others, if they need to know what the virtual machine is used for. Like in an enterprise setting, you might have virtual machines for various things and have a description for each one. For our purposes, not necessary. Clicking into system here, you can see we have our base memory. This is what we set up during the wizard, 2048 megabytes or 2 gigabytes of RAM dedicated to this virtual machine. And it shows here the maximum on my computer is 32768 or 32 gigabytes of memory or RAM. Chipset, pointing device, all of these things here are generally not needed. You shouldn't need to mess with these. Processor, so this is the CPU processor of your host computer, and you can decide if you want to give that virtual machine more power, more CPU, more processing power. Usually one processor core is set by default. I like to move that up to at least 4. You'll also hear this as quad core or dual core. This is what it's relating to, is the number of cores on your computer. And again, if you're not sure how many your computer has, back into the task manager, into performance, and this time CPU. Now yours will probably look like this by default, and right here it'll tell you that there are 8 cores. By the way, if your task manager looks like this, click more details, and then you can get to the performance tab that I mentioned previously. And that will show you the type of CPU you have and how many cores. Don't worry about logical processors. But one thing to mention while we're in here is virtualization. And you can see that this is enabled. So as we said earlier in the video, you need to make sure that virtualization is enabled in your BIOS before going through this process. Here's how you can check that. And if you haven't seen that part of the video, please go back. There's a section for Intel and AMD based systems, as the options are named differently. The option can be named differently depending on your BIOS as well. So Google's your friend in that case. So back to our VirtualBox settings here, we've decided to go with a quad-core CPU, and our execution cap, we're not messing with that. That's just if you want to keep this virtual machine from taking away a load of CPU resources. We're not worried about that in this case. And acceleration, we can ignore. Now, we're going to skip a lot of these settings as the rest are going to be irrelevant, but one thing we do need to change is display and video memory. This harks back to what our warning message down here is talking about. For a Windows virtual machine, you need at least 48 megabytes of video memory. Video memory is RAM that your graphics card uses, or the graphics processor in your computer, whatever that may be. We're going to just ratchet this up. I've got a good graphics card in this machine, so we don't need to worry about that. And we're also going to enable 3D acceleration. We can actually ratchet it up a bit more. That must be a new feature that hasn't been there previously. You can also give the virtual machine multiple monitors. Generally not recommended. A single monitor for a virtual machine is probably the best way to go about it. And that's pretty much everything we need to do here. One other notable section is USB. If you have problems with any devices not working in the virtual machine, such as your mouse, keyboard, camera, microphone, etc., you may need to add them here. And what that does is takes the USB device away from the host machine and pushes it through to the virtual machine. It is usually smart enough for keyboards and mice to work, but some other specialized USB devices won't work by default, and this is the menu where you can mess with that. I haven't got much experience with this, to be perfectly honest, so I'm not going to delve into it, but just know that it's there. We click OK. You can see our icon now has changed, and we are a Windows 10 virtual machine called YouTube Testbed. It's powered off, and here's a summary of all of the settings that we have set up. Now, one thing you always need to do with any computer, one that you've built yourself, or you know, if you're doing a repair, or in this case creating a virtual machine, is you need to have an operating system installed. The operating system in our host machine here is Windows 11, and in our guest machine it's going to be Windows 10. What we need to do is to actually install it. So usually if you want to install Windows, you would use a CD or DVD or a USB stick. This is a virtual machine, so we don't have a virtual CD drive or DVD drive, and we don't want to go through the hassle of creating a bootable USB stick to then pass through to the virtual machine. But we don't have to. We can get what's called the ISO file for Windows, which is what you would put onto a DVD or a USB stick if you were doing it that way, and just tell the virtual machine to use that ISO on its first start so that it can then give you the option to install Windows. So that's what we're going to do next. So if you need to download a Windows ISO, the Microsoft website is probably going to be a good place to start. I just did a quick Google search and found this download Windows 10 page on the Microsoft site, and you can see that you have the option here to create a Windows 10 installation media. And this, the way Microsoft do it now, is through this download tool or this media creation tool. I'm not going to go through that process here. If you would like me to create a video on that, let me know. But this is the section that you'll want to follow. Using the tool to create installation media, and it's an ISO file we're going to create. And you can see that there's a guide here on how to create the ISO. And that's a file, just a type of file that your computer can save, and that's the type of file we're going to use to send to our virtual machine for it to then install Windows. Now, I've already gone through this process, and I'm just going to go through setting the virtual machine to now use that ISO as its installation media. Now, if that all sounds very complicated, don't worry, we'll make it as simple as possible. But what we're going to do is we're going to go to our settings again. Okay, this time we're going to storage, and you can see here some slightly complicated looking things. We're not going to worry about these. So in the storage tab here, you can see the storage devices that our YouTube Testbed has available to it. The only one that's actually currently populated is this virtual disk image or VDI file. That's our virtual hard disk we created during the setup wizard. We're going to put a disk image, which is our ISO file, into this device here. Again, this is just a virtual device. It's actually a virtual CD drive or DVD drive that VirtualBox creates for you by default. We're going to uncheck the live CD/DVD box, and optical drive, we're going to hit the icon and we're going to choose a disk file. From here, you want to navigate to wherever you have your Windows 10 ISO. So I have located my Windows 10 ISO file here, and we just click that, click open. You can see now that it is in our virtual CD or DVD drive here, and we can just go ahead and click OK. At this point, the rest of the process should be very straightforward. I would be very surprised if most of you out there couldn't continue from here by yourselves without the rest of this video, but let's go ahead with it and show you anyway. So the first thing we want to do now is to start the computer, or start the virtual machine in this case, and you'll see a window pops up. You get what's called a BIOS splash screen, which in this case is a VirtualBox screen, and then a Windows logo. So this Windows logo here only appears because we have passed through that ISO file, that installation media. Without that installation media, the virtual machine would not have any operating system to boot, and you would get an error message here. But because we passed over that ISO file, we get the normal Windows 10 installer will start up. Now, my ISO file is probably not the latest version of Windows 10. It's probably a little old, but it shouldn't matter. The install process is basically the same for most operating systems. Things may look slightly different. Things might be worded differently. Microsoft have a tendency to add a lot of unnecessary steps to the installer, such as telemetry, add preferences, and a number of other things. We're not really too worried about those in this case. If this was my own personal computer, I would actually go through and disable most of those options. But because this is a test bed, it's a virtual machine, it's used for messing around, for trialing out software, and for doing things that we don't want to potentially break our main system with, then we don't really care. Because we're not going to be using this system as what we call a daily driver. It's just going to be used sporadically when needed. So we'll pause here and we'll come back once the installer kicks in. Okay, so we are now at the stage of the Windows setup wizard. So we have created our VM, we've allocated it its virtual hardware, we have told it to use the Windows 10 ISO file, and once we started it, the process began, and eventually we landed at this page. So at this point in the process, these steps are going to be standard for you, for wherever you live, whatever formats you use, whatever keyboard you use, etc. For me, I'm based in Ireland, so I will be using English Ireland and an Irish layout keyboard. Obviously choose the right options here for your locale and your keyboard, etc. So we click next. We're going to hit install now. So the setup process here can take some time depending on a number of factors, particularly where your ISO file is stored. If it's on an external device of any type, it will take longer for it to load, and also just the general speed of your computer, but more importantly is the amount of resources you've given this virtual machine. So that's how much RAM, the CPU, how many CPU cores you have dedicated to it. That will all have an effect on the speed of the install process here. We're not going to sit through the entire process. We'll come back once it's done. But the main thing to bear in mind here is that this can take some time. So grab a coffee, sit back, relax, and enjoy the Windows install. So once the install wizard progresses a little bit, you'll get to this activate Windows screen. If you have an activation key for Windows 10, you can enter it in here. We don't, and we are going to select I don't have a product key here. If you are planning to use this Windows virtual machine for any length of time, you do need a product key. For legal reasons, that is required. For our purposes, we are setting this virtual machine up as a demonstration for this video, and Microsoft do allow short-term use of Windows, a timed trial you may call it, of Windows without a product key, and that's what we're going to utilize today. So we're selecting I don't have a product key, and we shall move through the installer to get our Windows virtual machine up and running. The next step is to decide which version of Windows 10 we're going to install. Some of you may not know that there are multiple different versions of Windows, not just Windows 10 or 11 or Windows 7, but within those families of operating systems there are various versions. We're going to select Windows 10 Pro. Your ISO file, Windows 10 ISO, may not have all of these options. Again, this is not something you need to worry about. Choose Windows 10 Home if it's the only one available. Don't choose Home N or Pro N. Those are specialist operating systems which we don't need to mess with. So once we click Next, we will agree to the license terms. That's required. And at this point, we are going to choose a custom install. The reason we're choosing a custom install is because this is a virtual machine. We want to use the entire virtual hard disk. That's the storage space we've dedicated to this virtual machine. We don't want to only use a small portion of it. We want it all to be available within the virtual machine. So you can see that the VM only sees one hard drive here, drive 0, and that is our virtual hard disk. It's 50 gigabytes as we corrected. And it has 50 gigabytes of free space. That means that there's nothing within that virtual hard drive. We're going to leave that selected and we're going to click Next. Windows installer will then go ahead and partition that drive and prepare it for the Windows install to take place. And you don't need to worry about how that's done or what those partitions are or what they're used for. That's for Microsoft to determine and for Windows to use. But just know that the virtual hard disk that we've created will be chopped up into smaller bits for Windows itself. It's just how Windows works. This part of the install process here is probably the longest portion, so just let it run and enjoy that coffee, and we'll be back. So after some time, the install should bring you to a screen similar to this. A couple of restarts will have happened in the time between, but they're not interactive. They will take place themselves. But you'll eventually get to this Windows setup page. So you choose your region. In my case, that's going to be Ireland. You can then choose your keyboard layout again. Don't know why it asks you to do all this twice. We don't need a second keyboard layout. I only speak one language and barely at that. And then it's going to go through some more setup. And as I alluded to, this is a testbed machine. It's not my daily driver machine. It's not a machine I'm going to use regularly. So I don't really care about the telemetry and Microsoft gathering data from the virtual machine and things like that. So we're just going to skip past this part. And eventually you should get to a Windows desktop. So we'll see you there. So now we've reached the Windows 10 desktop, and Windows itself will now connect to the internet due to the virtual network device that's been given to it, and it will download any required drivers or software it believes you need for this virtual machine. So the screen resolution and some other bits and pieces might change automatically. It's just part of Windows setting itself up, nothing really to worry about. That's basically it. That is our tutorial. I just have a couple of additional notes to add here at the end. So the virtual machine, during the install process, it will reboot a number of times, and you may see a screen where it says press any key to boot from CD or DVD, and that is because of the ISO file that we told VirtualBox to use as our installation media earlier on. We just want to eject that. You can think of it like a CD or DVD, as I mentioned, and we just want to remove that now. So you can do that just by going to Devices, Optical Drives, and then remove disk from virtual drive. And that will then stop that prompt from appearing and should just boot straight into the new virtualized Windows 10 operating system that we've installed whenever you start this VM. Another thing to note as well is in these icons here in the bottom right, these are just little status icons relating to the virtual hardware of the virtual machine itself. You generally don't need to interact with these, but you might find some handy tooltips down here. Tooltip is that little thing that appears when you lead the mouse over an icon, and sometimes your mouse might get stuck inside the virtual machine. If that happens and you're using VirtualBox, as we are in this tutorial, press the control key on your keyboard, but make sure it's the one on the right of the keyboard, not the left control. Right control will eject the mouse cursor basically from the virtual machine. In most cases, it will use it as kind of a dynamic mouse, where you can see if I move my mouse into the window, I'm now controlling the virtual machine. If I move it out, I'm controlling my own host computer here. and it's usually done in that fashion. But sometimes you can end up with your mouse cursor being captured by the virtual machine and not released when you bring it to the edge of the screen. Right control will release that. One last point is that this icon here, which is a little blue rectangle with a V on it at the moment, this may show a little green turtle icon, and that means that your virtual machine is running slowly. And there are various reasons for this. The most common is that you also have a thing called Hyper-V enabled within Windows. This is not something we're going to cover in this tutorial. You need to turn that off and then restart your computer for VirtualBox to be able to run correctly. That is correct at the time of writing in May of 2022. VirtualBox, or Oracle I should say, are in the process of developing a method for VirtualBox VMs to run using Hyper-V. But currently the best process is to disable Hyper-V if you're going to use VirtualBox. If you're not going to use VirtualBox and you want to use Hyper-V, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, or the Windows subsystem for Android, you need to have Hyper-V or virtualization enabled within Windows. They are generally not cross-compatible, and it's best to just stick with one. And that's it. Some final notes in relation to using a VM and some things that you can do with it. You can install software here as you would any other Windows computer. You can try out things that you may not want to try on your host computer, such as a particular piece of free software that you might think is too good to be true. And in those situations, when a product is free, then it generally means that you or your data are the product. And that means that that company will be gathering data from you or your computer, and that is then sold for them to earn their profits. So a virtual machine is perfect for those sorts of things, where you want to try out a piece of software, see if it's worth running, is it worth keeping on your host computer, or can you do what you need to do with it within a virtual machine, etc., etc. Also, anything that's maybe a legal grey area, we'll say, it's a good idea to run those sorts of things within a virtual machine, because if legal grey areas are a hotbed for viruses and malware and things like that, and if your computer happens to get infected, when it's a virtual computer, it's very easy just to wipe it out and create a new one. You won't be keeping your important documents or photos within this virtual machine, so just deleting it and starting up a new one should be fairly straightforward, and not really something that you should worry about. On that note, it is possible to set up backups, or what are called snapshots, of a virtual machine. And that's just like taking a picture, a snapshot of the virtual machine as it exists at a point in time. So what I would recommend you do is go through installing whatever you think you need within this virtual machine first, then take a snapshot. And in that case, if you do ever end up with a virus, or you need to roll back to a previous version or anything like that, your snapshot will be your go-to. That's not within the scope of this video, but the options are here within VirtualBox, and you can Google or search YouTube for further details. If you have any questions or comments about this, leave them in the comment section below. And if you want to see more like it, subscribe. Cheers. Take care.